My name is Alexis. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, dependable, low drama. The kind of person who doesn't demand attention, who finishes what she starts, who listens more than she speaks. I've worked in environments where noise is rewarded, loud confidence, visible ambition. But I was never built that way. I learned early that being calm made others comfortable. Being competent made them trust me. Being quiet made me easy to overlook. Most people thought that they understood who I was. They saw someone reliable, maybe a little too patient, someone who would keep things moving without asking for credit. If I disappeared from a meeting, nothing would fall apart immediately. And that, I think, is how I became invisible without realizing it. Not because I lacked value, but because my value didn't interrupt anyone. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about villains or heroes. It's about awareness. Slow, uncomfortable, irreversible awareness. It's about the moment you realize the rules of the room were written long before you walked in, and you were never meant to win by them. It's about what happens when you stop reacting and start observing. I'm telling this now because for a long time, I didn't have the language for what I was experiencing. I only knew the feeling, a quiet pressure, a sense that no matter how hard I worked, the ground beneath me wasn't solid. Much later, I would finally understand why, because I discovered my name on a layoff list dated months ago, long before any conversation, long before any warning, long before I stopped giving everything I had. By then, the truth was impossible to ignore. I was working hard for a future that was already canceled. What follows is not a dramatic retelling of office politics or a victory speech. It's a documentary of inner shifts, of silence changing meaning, of preparation happening where no one thought to look. There are no raised voices here, no public scenes, just choices, small, precise, and final. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't advertise yourself, if you've ever sensed something was wrong but couldn't prove it yet, if you've ever stayed quiet, not because you were weak, but because you were watching, then you'll recognize this path. I'm not sharing this to teach anyone a lesson. I'm sharing it because honesty matters, especially the kind that doesn't ask for applause. So before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever felt yourself being phased out before anyone said a word? To them, I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the problem child, not the rising star everyone watched. I was the person things defaulted to when they needed to be done correctly and quietly. If a process broke, I fixed it. If a deadline slipped, I absorbed the pressure. If two departments misunderstood each other, I translated, without attaching my name to the solution. In meetings, my voice was steady and measured. I didn't interrupt. I waited for pauses. Sometimes those pauses never came. When they did, my contributions were often summarized later by someone else, louder, more confident in tone, using almost the exact same words. I noticed. I didn't correct it, not because I didn't care, but because I believed, naively, that consistency would eventually speak for itself. People describe me as low maintenance. They meant it as a compliment. What it really meant was that I didn't demand acknowledgement. I didn't push back publicly. I didn't force visibility. I made their lives easier, and ease is rarely celebrated. My role expanded without ever being formally redefined. I trained new hires who would later outrank me. I documented workflows that leadership praised as company-changing, then filed them away without attaching ownership. When something succeeded, it was the team. When something stalled, it quietly became mine. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no insults, no dramatic moments I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. That's what made it so difficult to articulate. Everything was polite, everything was reasonable. Everything was just enough to keep me doubting my own discomfort. I told myself I was lucky to be trusted. I told myself this was how grown professionals behaved. Head down, results first, recognition later. I told myself that being indispensable was protection. But invisibility has a texture to it. It's subtle, but once you feel it, it's unmistakable. It's being excluded from conversations you built the foundation for. It's watching decisions get made about processes you manage without anyone asking your opinion. It's realizing your calendar is full of responsibilities but empty of influence. Performance reviews reflected this perfectly. Always positive, always vague. You're doing great work. Everyone relies on you. We don't have any concerns. But also, no roadmap, no next step, no concrete future. Praise without trajectory. I didn't push for clarity. I thought patience was maturity, what they never saw. And what I didn't fully understand yet was how closely I was watching everything. Not emotionally, logistically. I knew who depended on which reports, which teams couldn't function if certain handoffs failed, which leaders asked for summaries because they didn't understand the underlying systems. I knew where the knowledge lived and where it didn't. But at that time, I wasn't cataloging leverage. I was just doing my job well. There's a particular kind of person organizations quietly rely on. Someone who stabilizes chaos without announcing it. Someone who doesn't create waves. Someone whose absence would be inconvenient, but whose presence is taken for granted. I fit that shape perfectly. And because I fit it so well, no one questioned whether it was fair. I didn't complain. I didn't escalate. I didn't warn anyone that something felt off. From the outside, I was content. Inside, I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Not burned out, displaced. Like I was standing in a room where decisions were happening behind glass. Still, I stayed, because I believed effort accumulated, because I believed loyalty mattered, because I believed being essential would eventually make me visible. I didn't yet understand that they already knew exactly who I was to them, and that version of me had a ceiling. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the truth I'm least proud of. Not that I stayed silent, but that I hesitated long enough to question whether it even counted. It was small, administrative, the kind of thing people would laugh off if you mentioned it out loud. A meeting was scheduled about a process overhaul I had designed, not contributed to, designed. I saw the calendar invite an hour before it started. My name wasn't on it. I remember staring at the screen, feeling that brief, sharp confusion, the kind that passes quickly if you let it. I told myself it was an oversight, a scheduling error. Someone forgot to add me. So I waited. The meeting ended. No follow-up, no notes, no one mentioned it. Later that afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk and casually said, "We decided to move forward with a few changes. Nothing major. You'll see them roll out next quarter." We decided. I nodded, asked a neutral clarifying question, took notes. I didn't say, "I built the system you just revised without me." I didn't say, "Why wasn't I there?" I told myself that if it mattered, it would come up again. That was the cut. Not deep enough to bleed, just enough to mark the skin. After that, there were others. An email chain I was forwarded on after decisions were finalized. A document labeled "final" contradicted the workflow I maintained. A junior colleague presented insights I had walked them through privately, with no mention of where they came from. Each instance alone was defensible. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. What made it harder was everyone else's reaction, or lack of one. No one seemed uncomfortable. No one paused and said, "Should Alexis be here?" The omission felt normalized, as if my absence made sense to them in a way it didn't to me yet. I started paying closer attention, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. I watched who was invited early and who was looped in later, who spoke freely and who was summarized by others, whose decisions were for and who they were merely about. And I noticed something uncomfortable. I was becoming a resource, not a participant. People came to me for clarity, for fixes, for context. Then they went elsewhere to decide what to do with that information. I was a reference point, a stabilizer, not a voice. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, because I believed in timing. I believed raising concerns required evidence, not feelings. And at that point, all I had were impressions. Patterns still forming, cuts still shallow. So I adjusted internally instead. I began documenting more carefully. I saved versions. I noted dates. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't even consciously frame it as protection. It felt prudent, like locking a door you didn't realize had been left open. The hardest part was how reasonable everyone remained. No hostility, no tension, just a gentle reconfiguration that placed me slightly to the side of things I once centered. I remember thinking, if I say something now, I'll sound paranoid. I remember thinking, maybe this is what growth looks like, letting go. But there was a quiet voice underneath those thoughts, one I didn't fully trust yet. It asked a single question, over and over. Why does it feel like something is being decided without me? That question didn't demand action, it just waited. And I learned something important in that waiting. The earliest signs of displacement don't announce themselves as loss. They arrive as a courtesy, as efficiency, as decisions were made to save time. The cut healed quickly on the surface, but underneath something had shifted. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment I stopped assuming inclusion was automatic. And once that assumption is gone, you start seeing everything. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect isn't the act itself. It's how easily it becomes routine. After that first omission, I told myself to reset, to assume good intent, to stay professional. And on the surface, I did. I showed up the same way, delivered the same quality of work, met every deadline, smiled in the same calm, unthreatening way that made people comfortable asking for more. And they did ask for more. My responsibilities grew, but my visibility didn't. In fact, it shrank. I was consulted after decisions instead of before. I was praised privately and overlooked publicly. When I flagged potential risks, they were acknowledged politely, and then ignored until they materialized, at which point the room would turn to me with a look that said, "Can you fix this?" I fixed it every time. The rationalizations came easily. I told myself leadership was busy. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself that staying unreactive was a form of professionalism. I had seen people labeled difficult for much less, and I didn't want to become that person, the one whose valid concerns got dismissed because of tone. So I stayed neutral, measured, reasonable. What I didn't realize was that by absorbing these moments silently, I was teaching everyone exactly how much disregard I would tolerate. Meetings became more performative. I was there to provide data, not direction. I would explain constraints carefully, only to watch someone reframe them as flexible in the next breath. When I didn't challenge it, the room took that as consent. I began to notice how often my work was described without my name attached. The process allows for, the system was built to, passive voice everywhere, as if the work had appeared on its own. Once, during a quarterly review, a director praised a major efficiency gain, one I had spent months implementing. He smiled at me afterward and said, I appreciate you." I nodded. That was the extent of it. I didn't yet have the courage, or maybe the clarity to say, appreciation without protection is just sentiment. The most unsettling part was how normal it all started to feel. I adjusted my expectations downward without consciously deciding to. I stopped anticipating inclusion. I stopped being surprised when it didn't happen. That internal shift scared me more than anything external. Because normalization is quiet. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like an adaptation. I remember catching myself once, mid-thought, thinking, "It's fine. They don't need me in that meeting." That sentence lingered, because part of me knew it wasn't true. They did need me. They just didn't need to acknowledge me. That's when I started listening differently. Not to what people said, but to what they assumed. They assumed I would always be available. They assumed I wouldn't escalate. They assumed I wouldn't leave. They assumed my silence meant satisfaction. And why wouldn't they? I had trained them to believe that. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Confrontation would have required me to make my discomfort visible, and visibility had already proven risky. Instead, I began separating my inner world from my outer behavior. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I started taking inventory. I noted how many processes had only one true owner, how many backups existed only on paper, how many relationships were dependent on my quiet mediation. I tracked dependencies the way an architect tracks load-bearing walls, not to destroy anything, but to understand what actually held the structure up. This wasn't anger, it was clarity forming, and clarity has a different energy. It doesn't rush, it doesn't demand immediate action. It observes, waits, and refuses to be gaslit by politeness. By the time I realized I was no longer surprised by the disrespect, I also realized something else. I had stopped believing that staying quiet would eventually protect me. I was still silent, but now it was no longer reflexive. It was deliberate, and that difference would matter more than I understood. It became clear to me slowly, the way truths often do when you're not emotionally invested in being right. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I had been assigned. Not formally, not maliciously, but consistently. I was the reliable constant, the one who smoothed edges, filled gaps, and made other people's decisions look competent. My role wasn't leadership or growth. My role was containment. I was there to absorb complexity so others could operate simply. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how often new initiatives were introduced to me as fates accompli, how frequently my input was sought only to troubleshoot outcomes, never to shape direction. I noticed how my manager framed my work to others. Alexis will handle it, delivered with the same tone someone uses to describe a system feature, not a person. Useful, predictable, invisible. There was an unspoken expectation attached to that role. Gratitude without demand, excellence without ambition, stability without movement. And the thing is, I had complied. Not consciously, not strategically, but through years of reinforcing the same behavior. Solve quietly, accept vaguely, don't disrupt. People didn't think of me when discussing advancement because I never forced them to. They didn't fear losing me because I never acted like leaving was an option. I had made myself essential in function, but optional in the future. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange calm, like finally naming a weather pattern you'd been walking through for years. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, long after most people had left, staring at my reflection in the darkened monitor. I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If I disappeared tomorrow, what would they actually lose? The answer wasn't flattering, but it was honest. They would lose efficiency, continuity, institutional memory. They would lose the person who prevented small problems from becoming visible failures. But they wouldn't lose a voice in the room, because I was never positioned as one. That's when I understood the real risk of the role I'd been playing. Not that I was undervalued, but that my value was non-transferable and non-promotable. It existed only in service, never in strategy. And that kind of value is easy to discard once it's documented. I started seeing hints of that too. My processes were being codified, my explanations are summarized. My work gradually detached from my presence. People asked fewer questions, not because they understood more, but because they felt they didn't need me in real time anymore. That should have scared me. Instead, it clarified something important. I realized I had been mistaking usefulness for security. Security comes from leverage, not loyalty. That was the moment I stopped trying to be seen as indispensable in effort and started asking what it would mean to be indispensable in consequence. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. That would have raised questions too soon. Instead, I refined it. I became even more composed, even more neutral, even more reliable. But internally, the frame had shifted. I no longer asked, how do I support the system? I asked, how does the system actually depend on me? And once you ask that question honestly, the answers arrive whether you're ready or not. I saw the role clearly then, not as an insult, but as a position. One that came with expectations and limits. One that would never expand on its own. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been placed. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no email that changed everything. In fact, the day itself was almost disappointingly ordinary. That's what made it impossible to ignore, because nothing external could be blamed for what happened internally. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were heavy with routine. Standing meetings, status updates, the kind of day where you move from one obligation to the next without reflection. I was sitting in a conference room, listening to a presentation about future alignment. Slides moved forward. Words like streamlining and optimization floated past without anchoring anywhere meaningful. Then I saw it. One slide, brief, almost throwaway, a proposed restructuring chart. It wasn't detailed, names weren't filled in, but roles were. And I knew enough about timelines, dependencies, and leadership behavior to understand what I was looking at. There was no place for me on it. Not a demotion, not a lateral move, just absence. I didn't react, not outwardly. I took notes like everyone else, asked a neutral question. The meeting ended. People filed out, chatting about lunch plans and deadlines. I stayed seated for a moment after the room emptied. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me went still. It wasn't panic, it wasn't anger. It was clarity. In that quiet, I understood something with unsettling certainty. Decisions about my future had already been made, and I had not been part of them. The role I occupied was being dissolved, not because it wasn't valuable, but because it had been extracted. I walked back to my desk and continued my work, answered messages, completed tasks. On the surface, nothing changed. But internally, a line had been crossed. Up until that moment, I had been adjusting, interpreting, hoping timing would resolve the ambiguity. Now the ambiguity was gone. I didn't need confirmation or explanation. I didn't need to ask questions that would be met with rehearsed reassurance. I knew, and knowledge has a weight to it. Once you carry it, you can't pretend you don't. That afternoon, I opened my notebook, the black one I had been using sporadically. I wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and underneath it, a single sentence. Assume nothing is accidental. That was the shift. I stopped attributing events to oversight or coincidence. I stopped giving unearned benefit of the doubt, not in a cynical way, but in a factual one. I began treating the situation as it was, not as I wished it to be. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was grief, yes, but it was distant, like something already accepted at a deeper level. What replaced it was focus. I didn't confront my manager. I didn't ask for reassurance. I didn't start looking for allies. I understood instinctively that any of those actions would expose me before I was ready. Silence, in that moment, wasn't avoidance. It was containment. I realized then that the power I still had lay in asymmetry. I knew something they didn't know I knew. That imbalance mattered. From that day on, I watched differently. Meetings weren't just conversations. They were data points. Timelines weren't projections. They were signals. I stopped volunteering interpretations. I let others talk. And in that listening, patterns became unmistakable. References to future planning that never included me. Comments about leaner teams. Casual mentions of redundancy are framed as efficiency. Always abstract, always impersonal. No one looked at me when they said these things. That too was information. The shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't change my job title or my daily responsibilities. It changed my orientation. I stopped moving toward the future they were implying and started preparing for the future they weren't naming, quietly, methodically, without resentment. That was the day I understood that silence could be something other than endurance. It could be a choice. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been instinctive, a reflex shaped by professionalism and self-control. Now, it was intentional, measured, chosen with purpose. I stopped speaking automatically. I stopped filling gaps. I let pauses stretch just long enough for other people to reveal what they assumed I would cover. And they did. People talked more freely when I didn't interrupt with solutions. They speculated. They overpromised. They dismissed risks out loud that I had once quietly neutralized behind the scenes. I watched it happen without correcting them. To them, my quiet looked like the same compliance they were used to. To me, it was reconnaissance. I began declining meetings. Not all of them, just the ones where my presence was habitual rather than necessary. I framed it as workload management. No one objected. In fact, some seemed relieved, as if my absence simplified things. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. In the meetings I did attend, I spoke less and documented more. I asked clarifying questions instead of offering solutions. I let people commit to timelines without cushioning them. I noticed who followed up and who didn't. Silence has a way of amplifying other people's voices. And in that amplification, inconsistencies surface. I saw how often my name came up when things went wrong, and how rarely it did when things went smoothly. I saw how comfortable people were assuming I would step in if needed, even as they planned around my eventual redundancy. They mistook my restraint for resignation. That was their error. Behind the scenes, I was reorganizing my time and attention. I stopped doing invisible labor. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't explicitly requested, not out of spite, but out of accuracy. If something wasn't acknowledged as my responsibility, I let it remain unhandled until it was formally assigned. The system began to show strain, nothing catastrophic, just small delays, confusion. Follow-up emails that asked, "Do you know where this is?" or "Can you clarify what happened here?" I responded politely, factually, without urgency. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply no longer compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed the shift. Or maybe they noticed and misread it. I overheard someone say, "Alexis seems tired lately." Another remarked, "She's probably just coasting." Coasting. The word didn't bother me. It clarified how deeply they misunderstood the situation. They thought my silence meant disengagement, that I had accepted the role assigned to me and was slowly fading into the background. In reality, I had never been more alert. I was mapping dependencies in real time, tracking where knowledge bottlenecks formed when I didn't intervene, observing how often decisions relied on assumptions I used to quietly correct. And I was documenting everything: dates, requests, omissions, versions. Not for revenge, but for accuracy. I wanted a clean record, free of emotion, in case clarity ever needed to be proven. There's a kind of power in choosing not to correct people when they're underestimating you. It creates space to prepare, space to decide. During this period, I also began recalibrating internally. I stopped tying my identity to being needed. I reminded myself daily that competence doesn't require an audience, and that dignity doesn't require permission. Silence, I learned, isn't passive. It's a stance. And when it's chosen deliberately, it changes the balance of every interaction. People reveal their expectations, their blind spots, their dependencies. By the time they realized something was different, it would already be too late to reframe it as a misunderstanding. Because by then, I wasn't waiting to be included anymore. I was deciding what came next. What they never noticed was how much of the system still moved through me, even after they stopped looking directly at me. Because when you've been quiet for a long time, people stop checking what you're doing. They assume continuity. They assume stability. They assume that whatever has always worked will keep working, untouched, unexamined. That assumption gave me space. I didn't announce that I was preparing. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I didn't suddenly become guarded or secretive. Outwardly, I remained exactly who they thought I was: composed, reliable, unremarkable. Internally, I became precise. I began by mapping everything I touched, not in an emotional sense, but in a structural one. I listed processes I owned outright, and then the ones I influenced indirectly. I traced how information flowed from one team to another, where delays occurred, and where misunderstandings were quietly resolved before they became visible. What emerged wasn't a list of tasks. It was a map of dependence. There were systems no one fully understood because they had never needed to. I had always been there to interpret anomalies, to translate between technical and non-technical language, to smooth transitions when assumptions failed. Over time, those interventions had become invisible, not because they were insignificant, but because they were consistent. Consistency is easy to underestimate. I also noticed how much of my knowledge was contextual, not documented in manuals or dashboards. It lived in conversation, in memory, in pattern recognition. That kind of knowledge doesn't transfer cleanly. It requires time, attention, and humility to replace. No one was investing in any of those. They believed documentation was enough. Those processes could be extracted without consequence. That people were interchangeable as long as the output looked the same on paper. They were wrong, but I didn't correct them. Instead, I documented selectively. I made sure what existed on record was accurate but not exhaustive, clear but not interpretive. Anyone could follow it, but only if they already understood the underlying logic. That wasn't manipulation, it was honesty. You can't write intuition into a checklist. I also began preparing personally. I reviewed my contracts, my benefits, my non-compete clauses. I updated my records and ensured my work was compliant, clean, and defensible. I organized my files so that nothing could be questioned later. No loose ends, no emotional residue. Preparation isn't dramatic, it's meticulous. I noticed how often people came to me with last-minute requests framed as emergencies. Before, I would drop everything to accommodate them. Now I asked for context, for deadlines in writing, for confirmation of priority. That small change alone exposed how much had been resting on my unspoken flexibility. Some requests dissolved once they had to be articulated. Others revealed gaps no one had acknowledged. Still, no one connected these changes to strategy. They assumed I was becoming more by the book, more procedural, less emotionally invested. That suited me fine. What they also didn't notice was how much I was learning during this time. Not about my job, I already knew that, but about power, about how organizations make decisions, about how outcomes are shaped long before they're announced. I paid attention to who avoided eye contact during certain conversations, who deferred upward instinctively, who used vague language when specifics were inconvenient. These weren't personal flaws. They were signals. And I logged them, not to expose anyone, but to understand the terrain. There was no rush, no countdown clock. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic reveal or a perfect moment. I was building readiness, emotional readiness, legal readiness, strategic readiness. Because once you see how quietly decisions are made about people, you understand the importance of choosing your own moment just as quietly. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. I didn't imagine apologies or recognition. I let go of those outcomes entirely. What mattered was clarity and control. They thought I was still orbiting the system, dependent on its approval. They didn't notice that I had stepped outside of it, just enough to see it whole. By the time they realized how much had been resting on my silent presence, I would already be prepared for the truth they hadn't yet said out loud. And preparation, unlike hope, doesn't betray you. The reveal didn't come through a conversation. There was no meeting, no email marked urgent, no managers closing a door and lowering their voice. It arrived the way the most consequential truths often do, quietly, accidentally, hidden inside something no one thought I would read closely. I was reviewing archived documents late one evening. Not out of suspicion, but out of habit. I had been consolidating records, timelines, approvals, old planning decks, making sure my files were clean and complete. It was the kind of work I'd done dozens of times before. Unnoticed, unremarkable. That's when I saw it. A spreadsheet, dated months back, buried in a folder labeled Long-Term Planning Confidential. My access wasn't unusual. I had been granted broad permissions years earlier, back when trust was assumed, and boundaries were loose. I almost closed it without thinking. Instead, I scrolled. There was a column titled Role Impact, another titled Timing, and then one more, so clinical it felt impersonal to the point of cruelty, Exit Strategy. I didn't react immediately. I read slowly, carefully, row by row. And there it was. My name, not highlighted, not flagged, just listed. Neatly, efficiently, next to a projected date that had already passed. The language was restrained, professional, stripped of anything resembling emotion. Redundancy due to restructuring. Knowledge transfer in progress. Minimal operational risk. Minimal. I remember sitting back in my chair and feeling something settle rather than explode. The room was silent. My breathing is steady. No rush of anger, no disbelief. Only confirmation. This was the moment the final ambiguity disappeared. I hadn't imagined the patterns. I hadn't misread the signs. I had been working hard for a future that was already canceled. And the cancellation hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned, reviewed, and approved. I checked the date again. Months ago. That was when the second truth landed, heavier than the first. I had discovered my name on a layoff list dated months ago, while still being asked to optimize systems, mentor others, and ensure continuity. Continuity for after me. I didn't screenshot it, I didn't forward it, I didn't react at all. I closed the file and sat there for a long time, hands resting on the desk, mind unusually clear. This wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was procedural, efficient, the kind of decision organizations make without malice and without accountability. And that made it more instructive than painful. I understood then that everything I had felt, the distancing, the normalization of disrespect, the quiet extraction of my knowledge had been part of a sequence already in motion. Nothing I did after that planning date was meant to change my outcome. It was meant to smooth it. That realization stripped the situation of its emotional fog. There was no longer a need to wonder why, or to interpret tone, or to wait for honesty that was never coming. I had it, privately, and that privacy mattered. Because the leverage wasn't the document itself, it was the asymmetry. I knew the truth while they still believed I was unaware. That gap gave me something I hadn't had before, time on my own terms. I didn't feel triumphant, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt calm. Clarity does that. It removes the need for reaction. I reviewed the implications carefully. What I could do, what I wouldn't do. What lines I would not cross, no matter how justified they might seem. My moral code held firm. No sabotage, no emotional outbursts, no illegal acts, no humiliation. Only clean decisions. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook. They planned quietly. So will I. From that moment on, every action I took had a different orientation. Not toward fixing, not toward proving, not toward staying. toward positioning. The reveal didn't change my behavior overnight. It refined it, focused on it. It turned preparation into certainty. And certainty, I learned, is far more powerful than anger. Because once you know the truth and accept it, you stop asking for permission to protect yourself. You simply begin. Once you know the truth, there's a moment where everything slows down. Not because you're frozen, but because every option becomes visible at once. Paths you hadn't allowed yourself to consider appear, fully formed. And with them comes responsibility. Not for what's happening to you, but for how you respond. That was where I found myself. I didn't rush to act. I gave myself time to sit with the knowledge, to let it settle without turning into bitterness. I asked myself hard questions, the kind that don't have flattering answers. I could confront them. I imagined what that would look like. Presenting the document, asking for explanations, forcing a conversation they hadn't prepared to have yet. It might buy me time. It might lead to reassurances, revised plans, maybe even a counteroffer. But it would also reveal my awareness. And once awareness is revealed too early, leverage evaporates. I could resign quietly, leave on my own terms, protect my dignity, avoid the slow erasure. That option held a certain appeal, clean, simple, no entanglements. But it would also let them proceed exactly as planned, just faster, with fewer questions, fewer obligations. I could do nothing, continue as I was, wait for the formal process, accept the severance, and move on. That path required the least effort and the least risk. But it also required surrendering the only advantage I had, foresight. Or I could choose the option that felt least dramatic and most irreversible. I could move in silence. That option didn't involve confrontation or threats. It didn't require exposing the document or forcing accountability. It required patience, discipline, and restraint. It meant allowing the process they had designed to unfold, while quietly positioning myself so that when the outcome arrived, it would not be asymmetrical. I chose that path, not because it was safe, but because it was clean. Once the decision was made, everything else became simpler. I didn't second guess, I didn't revisit alternatives. I committed fully to the direction I had chosen. I began setting boundaries where none had existed. I reduced availability without announcing it. I ensured all requests were properly scoped and documented. I stopped volunteering for future-facing initiatives. Not defensively, just accurately. At the same time, I began preparing externally. I updated my professional materials discreetly. I reached out to contacts I trusted, not to complain, but to reconnect. I explored options without urgency, knowing I wasn't racing a visible clock. Most importantly, I protected my energy. I stopped investing emotionally in outcomes I could no longer influence. I did my job well, but I no longer tied my sense of worth to their recognition. That detachment wasn't cold, it was stabilizing. The irreversible part of the decision wasn't logistical, it was internal. Once I stopped hoping for fairness from a system that had already decided otherwise, I felt lighter, more grounded, less reactive. I no longer needed validation from people who had quietly written me out of their future, and that changed how I carried myself. There's a difference between someone who is waiting to be chosen and someone who has already chosen themselves. Others feel it, even if they can't articulate it. I noticed subtle shifts, fewer assumptions about my flexibility, more caution in how requests were framed, a slight hesitation before decisions were finalized without my input. It didn't matter. The decision had been made, not by them, but by me. I wasn't trying to win anything. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was ensuring that when the end came, it wouldn't catch me unprepared or diminished. I had chosen the one option that didn't require anyone else's cooperation. And once you choose that path, there's no going back to how things were. Moving in silence is not about secrecy. It's about alignment. Once I made my decision, my actions became quieter, not fewer. I wasn't hiding what I was doing, I simply stopped narrating it. I let my behavior match my intention without explanation. At work, I became almost indistinguishable from my former self. If someone wasn't looking closely, I met expectations. I delivered clean outputs. I maintained professionalism. But I no longer extended myself beyond what was required. No extra context, no anticipatory fixes, no emotional labor disguised as teamwork. If something needed my input, I provided it, precisely, in writing, and within scope. If it didn't, I let it pass. That alone changed the rhythm. Processes slowed slightly. Questions accumulated. Follow-ups increased. Nothing broke, but the smoothness people had come to expect began to fray at the edges. They didn't see it as a problem yet. Just growing pains, just transition stuff. Externally, I was just as methodical. I scheduled consultations, reviewed options, took notes, asked questions. I didn't announce that I was preparing for a departure. I didn't need to. Preparation doesn't require permission. I also made sure my record was impeccable. I closed loops, resolved ambiguities, documented decisions, not defensively, but thoroughly. I wanted no confusion about what I had done, what I was responsible for, and what lay outside my role. That clarity would matter later. What struck me most during this period was how little resistance there was to my quiet withdrawal. No one asked if everything was okay. No one checked in to see why I was less visible. My absence in certain conversations was barely noted. That indifference oddly was reassuring. It confirmed that my reading of the situation had been accurate. I wasn't imagining my marginalization. It had already been absorbed into the culture, and cultures don't reverse themselves out of sentiment. I continued to attend meetings where my presence was required, but I no longer anchored them. I let others lead discussions that they didn't fully understand. I answered questions when asked. I didn't correct misinterpretations unless they were explicitly mine to address. Silence, when chosen, does something interesting. It forces responsibility to surface. People became more cautious in their commitments, less confident in assumptions. They sensed that the safety net wasn't as elastic as it used to be, even if they couldn't name why. Still, no one suspected what was coming. That's the thing about organizational plans. They assume compliance until the very end. They rely on inertia, on people continuing to perform as if the future were still open. I let them believe that. Because I wasn't trying to disrupt the process. I was simply making sure I wouldn't be the only one surprised by its outcome. There were moments, quiet ones, where the temptation to speak up returned, to say, I know, to ask why, to demand acknowledgement. But those moments passed quickly. I reminded myself that an explanation wouldn't change what had already been decided, and that dignity doesn't come from being heard. It comes from choosing when not to speak. As weeks passed, I felt increasingly detached from the emotional undercurrents of the workplace. Not numb, just clear. I could see the structure for what it was, efficient, impersonal, unconcerned with narrative. So I responded in kind. I moved in silence, not because I was afraid, but because I was finished negotiating my worth in a room that had already decided to replace me. When the consequences finally began to surface, they wouldn't be the result of drama or defiance. They would be the natural outcome of alignment. And alignment, once established, doesn't announce itself. The first consequences didn't look like consequences at all. They arrived in confusion, as a mild inconvenience, as small disruptions no one initially connected to me. That's how these things begin. Not with collapse, but with questions that don't have immediate answers. Someone asked where a certain report lived. Another team couldn't reconcile two numbers that had always matched before. A project timeline slipped by a few days because a dependency hadn't been clarified early enough. None of it was dramatic, none of it triggered alarms, but it was new. I watched it unfold without commentary. When asked directly, I responded calmly and factually. I explained what I knew. I didn't volunteer what I used to anticipate. I didn't step in early to prevent discomfort. I let the system experience the friction it had been insulated from, and slowly people began to feel it. Meetings ran longer. Emails multiplied. Clarifying questions stacked up. Someone joked that things felt less smooth lately, said with a half smile, like an observation that didn't yet require reflection. What they didn't realize was that the smoothness had always come from somewhere, from someone. I noticed how often my name came up in passing, not in praise, but in reference. Alexis used to handle that. Alexis might know. We should check with Alexis. But the tone had changed. There was an assumption beneath it now, one that hadn't existed before. The assumption that I might not automatically catch things, that I might not already be on top of it, that they might need to ask instead of expect. That subtle shift mattered. Responsibility, once redistributed, is hard to quietly reclaim. I also noticed a change in how leadership communicated. More follow-ups, more requests for written confirmation. A slight tightening around decisions that used to feel casual, not panic, just caution. They were adapting, but adaptation takes time, and time was something their plan hadn't accounted for. I remained steady throughout it all, No visible satisfaction, no pointed silence, just consistency, the same calm presence, the same professionalism. I didn't withdraw emotionally, I simply stopped overfunctioning. That distinction protected me, because overfunctioning hides structural weaknesses. When it stops, those weaknesses surface, not as blame, but as reality. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. Two colleagues are speaking quietly near the printer. "I didn't realize how much she coordinated," one said. "I thought that was automated," the other replied. I didn't interrupt. I didn't acknowledge it. I walked past as if I hadn't heard a word. Not because I needed them to know, but because the realization was finally happening without my involvement. That's when you know the shift is real, when understanding arrives independently. Still, no one confronted me. No one asked if I was pulling back intentionally. It was easier, I think, to assume temporary factors. Workload, fatigue, transition. They hadn't yet connected consequence to choice, and I didn't help them do so. I kept doing exactly what my role required. Nothing more, nothing less. I met expectations cleanly. I stayed within scope. I documented everything. That restraint did more than any argument could have, because it made the impact undeniable and impersonalized. There was no one to blame, no behavior to correct, no attitude to manage, just outcomes. And outcomes, once visible, have a way of reframing decisions retroactively. By the time the consequences were felt clearly, the path they had chosen had already narrowed, and I was no longer standing in it. By the time the concern reached the surface, it had already lost its usefulness. It didn't arrive as an apology or a confession. It came as a shift in tone, a subtle urgency layered over familiar politeness. Meetings that had once felt routine now carried an edge. Questions asked twice, answers requested in writing, decisions revisited after being declared final. The system was no longer gliding, and people noticed. What they didn't realize was that nothing was wrong in the way they thought. No one had failed. No one had sabotaged anything. The structure was simply operating without its silent compensations. That's a hard thing to fix once exposed. I saw the first real signs of panic in small behaviors. A manager who used to speak in broad strokes began asking for details. A director who rarely followed up suddenly scheduled check-ins. The word continuity started appearing more frequently in conversations, spoken carefully, like a diagnosis no one wanted to name. Still, no one said my name in those moments. Not directly. Instead, there were indirect attempts to pull me closer again. I hadn't been included in for months. Casual messages asking for my thoughts on decisions already underway. A sudden interest in my long-term plans, framed as concern. "How are you feeling about your growth here? Where do you see yourself over the next year?" The questions came too late. Not because I was offended, but because they were reactive. They weren't rooted in curiosity. They were rooted in discomfort. And discomfort doesn't reverse structural decisions. I answered calmly, honestly, without revealing what I knew, without posturing, without signaling threat or dissatisfaction. I didn't lie, but I didn't volunteer reassurance either. That ambiguity unsettled them more than anger would have. I could feel the recalibration happening in real time. People are trying to reinsert me into conversations, to re-anchor processes that had drifted. But they were working from incomplete information, both about the system and about me. They didn't know I had already accepted the outcome. They didn't know I had already planned around it. And because of that, every attempt to fix things landed awkwardly, misaligned, too shallow or too late. One meeting stands out in my memory, a restructuring discussion, ironically framed as an opportunity for collaboration. I was invited in at the last minute, asked to weigh in on how responsibilities might shift. As I listened, I realized something striking. They were trying to solve a problem they didn't fully understand, using assumptions that no longer held. They spoke about coverage, about documentation, about transition plans. They didn't speak about trust, or loss, or time. Those are harder to quantify. I offered measured input, clarified facts, asked neutral questions. I didn't correct the underlying miscalculation, that they could reverse the impact without reversing the decision itself. Because you can't. Once someone knows they're expendable, the relationship changes irreversibly. Not out of spite, but out of realism. The organization was experiencing what it means to plan without redundancy of understanding. They had documented processes, but not the judgment calls behind them. They had continuity on paper, but not in practice. And now they were feeling the cost. What struck me most was the absence of accountability. No one acknowledged that a choice had been made prematurely. No one admitted that the plan had assumed compliance until the end. Instead, there was a quiet hope that things could simply be smoothed over. They couldn't, not because I refused to help, but because I had stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own design. By the time the concern became explicit, the path forward had already narrowed. Adjustments were possible, reversals were not, and I felt no satisfaction in that, only distance. Distance from a system that had finally begun to experience itself honestly. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost gentle. No slammed doors, no raised voices, no dramatic reveal of documents or timelines. Just a scheduled meeting, placed carefully on my calendar titled something neutral. Alignment check-in. I knew what it was before I walked in. So did they. The room was small, familiar, the kind of space designed to feel safe, collaborative, and contained. My manager was there, along with someone from leadership I hadn't spoken to one-on-one in years. They smiled, offered water, asked how I was doing. I answered simply, calmly, truthfully enough. They spoke first. They talked about change, about evolving needs, about how roles sometimes shift in ways that are hard to anticipate. The language was careful, abstracted, scrubbed of responsibility. No dates, no names, no acknowledgement of prior decisions. I listened without interrupting. Then came the part they had rehearsed, the invitation for dialogue, the opening for me to express surprise, concern, or confusion. The space where I was supposed to react emotionally so they could manage it. I didn't. Instead, I asked a single question, not accusatory, not confrontational. Can you tell me when this direction was first discussed? There was a pause, brief but telling. They answered vaguely, over time, as part of broader planning. Nothing finalized until recently. I nodded. I understand, I said, and I meant it. Because I wasn't there to argue about timelines, or fairness, or transparency. Those conversations only matter when both sides believe the future is still shared. Ours wasn't. They explained the transition plan, the support being offered, the next steps. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they were delivering difficult news professionally. I let them finish. When it was my turn, I didn't reference the document. I didn't reveal how long I had known. I didn't correct their narrative. I simply said, I've been preparing for this outcome. That sentence shifted the room, not because it was threatening, but because it disrupted their assumption. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't pleading. They asked what I meant. I've made sure my responsibilities are clearly documented, I continued. I've closed open loops, and I've already begun planning my next steps. No bitterness, no drama, just a fact. There was a moment of recalibration then. You could see it. The realization that this conversation wasn't unfolding the way they expected. That I wasn't something to be managed or reassured. I wasn't asking for anything, and that unsettled them. They offered appreciation, spoke about my contributions, used words like valuable and respected. I accepted them politely. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the timing. Because appreciation after the fact isn't leverage. It's closure. The meeting ended with handshakes and careful smiles. They said they wanted the transition to be smooth, that they hoped to stay in touch. I agreed, and I meant that too. Because the absence of heat wasn't strategic, it was genuine. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires expectation. I had released that. What remained was clarity. As I walked back to my desk, I felt something unexpected. Lightness. Not relief. Resolution. The kind that comes when you've already done the hardest part privately, long before anyone else catches up. They thought this meeting was the turning point. It wasn't. It was just the moment our understanding finally aligned. After it ended, people expected a reaction. Not immediately. No one is that direct. But in the subtle ways that follow moments of change. They watched for bitterness, withdrawal, a shift in tone, some sign that I had been wounded in a way that might make them uncomfortable. They didn't get one. What they got instead was consistency, calm, boundaries. In the weeks that followed, I completed my remaining responsibilities with care. Not as an obligation, but as a reflection of who I am when no one is watching. I didn't rush to erase my presence, and I didn't cling to it either. I moved forward. What surprised me most was how much of my identity had already detached from the role long before it officially ended. I had grieved quietly, privately, in advance. By the time the process became visible, I was already oriented elsewhere. That space between who I was there and who I was becoming was where my sense of self recalibrated. I realized I was no longer interested in being indispensable in silence, or in being praised for resilience while absorbing disproportionate weight. I didn't need to be the calm center of a system that couldn't see me as anything else. I wanted alignment, not just in work, but in values, in visibility, in the agency. I also understood something about myself that I hadn't before. My quiet had never been a weakness. It had been discipline. And discipline, when paired with clarity, becomes strength. I didn't leave with a chip on my shoulder. I didn't carry bitterness with me. Those things require ongoing attachment. I had already let go. Instead, I carried discernment. I knew what questions to ask now, what signals to trust, what patterns to take seriously early, before they calcify into structure. I understood that organizations don't always act with malice, but they always act with incentives, and that it's my responsibility, not theirs, to protect my future. The version of me that existed before had believed that loyalty would be reciprocated intuitively, that effort would be noticed eventually, that patience was always virtuous. The version of me now understands that patience without position is vulnerability. I'm still quiet, still measured, still observant, but I'm no longer invisible. Because invisibility isn't about volume. It's about whether your presence shapes outcomes. And I no longer stay in rooms where it doesn't. I don't announce my value. I don't chase acknowledgement. I don't over-explain. I choose. And that choice, repeated consistently, has changed how I move through the world. I don't fear being underestimated anymore. I recognize it as information, as an early signal that tells me whether something is aligned or not. And when it isn't, I don't wait for confirmation. I prepare quietly. There's a moment in every quiet ending where you realize something important. Not everything that ends is taken from you. Some things are simply returned. What I lost wasn't a role or a title or even a future that could have existed. What I lost was an illusion, the belief that effort alone guarantees security, that silence is always interpreted as strength, that being needed is the same as being valued. And what I gained was far more durable. I gained discernment. I learned that systems don't reward integrity by default. They reward alignment with incentives. That loyalty without leverage is not protection. And that waiting for fairness from structures designed for efficiency is a form of self-abandonment. But here's the part that matters most to me now. None of that requires anger to understand. This story isn't about revenge or triumph. It's about awareness arriving early enough to matter. It's about choosing dignity over drama, preparation over performance, self-trust over reassurance. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't demand apologies that would have changed nothing. I simply stopped offering my future to a system that had already decided it wasn't needed. And that decision, quiet, internal, irreversible, changed everything. If there's a moral here, it's a simple one. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. Listen to what's happening when nothing is being said. And never confuse being indispensable with being secure. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the space where clarity forms. If you're watching this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever sensed that your effort was being extracted rather than invested, if you've ever felt yourself being gently phased out before anyone admitted it, trust that instinct. You don't need permission to prepare. You don't need validation to choose yourself. And you don't need to explain your boundaries to honor them. You're allowed to move quietly. You're allowed to leave without a spectacle. You're allowed to outgrow rooms that only value you when you're convenient. I'm sharing this not as a warning, but as an invitation. An invitation to notice, to choose earlier, to protect your future with the same care you give your work. So I'll leave you with one question, an honest one, not a dramatic one. Have you ever realized too late that a place you were loyal to had already decided to move on without you? If you have, you're not alone. And if you haven't yet, pay attention.